This is the most popular game in the world right now. This. Look closely, it's the most played. So between the rubber banding issues, texture pop-in, static and dynamic mesh scaling issues, and low frame rate overall, the Xbox version of the game has a long way to go, but it's still leading the charge in sales. On PC alone, just for perspective, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds has now sold 30 million copies, with peak daily player count upwards of 2 million on PC. Today we're benchmarking PUBG on the Xbox, including a detailed look at graphics behavior and overall performance. This is done using GN's new in-house console benchmarking utilities that we've improved specifically as a result of this game. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly, makers of the Conductonaut liquid metal that we recently used to drop 20 degrees off of our temperatures. Thermal Grizzly also makes traditional thermal compounds for use on top of the IHS, like Cryonaut and Hydronaut pastes. Learn more at the link below. And for its help in improving our benchmarking utilities, we really only have good things to say about PUBG on the Xbox. By which I mean it's so flawed and has such bad performance that it really helped us fine-tune the test resolution of our tools that we use. So that's good, I guess. But we're going to break this video into a few sections. We'll talk about graphics issues and shortcomings there, some gameplay issues, rubber banding, things like that, frame rate performance and frame time performance on the Xbox One X, which has frame time spikes sometimes upwards of 100 to 130 milliseconds, when for 30 FPS, you should be closer to 33 milliseconds. Quite a disparate performance. So a brief explanation of the tools here. If you want more details on our benchmarking tools, we're not talking about how all of it works, it's all internal, but we have some information top level in the article linked in the description below. For the very basics, we have some new utilities in here now that will allow us to compare frame to frame where are the new pixels. By creating contrast maps with black and white pixels, we can see which pixels are new versus which are old, which is important because there are no frame rate software tools for the Xbox. You have to make your own, which we did. And when recording frame rate, what we're basically doing is analyzing the delta between the pixel values frame to frame, and sometimes that delta gets a little muddy because if you have things like aliasing or a game like PUBG, which just has a mixture of really odd attempts at optimization, poor optimization overall, poor performance overall, and weird frame rates sometimes. When you have all those problems, we need debugging tools, which is basically what the black and white mapping is, so that we can see what's going on frame to frame and determine, is that some kind of compression artifacting from capture? Is it aliasing of some kind? Or is it genuinely just an issue that we need to talk about? So more of that in the article, but let's get into the basics here. We're going to start with graphics, and then we'll get into frame rate and frame time performance. Graphics are easy to start with. From the instant the game was launched, it was clear what we were in for. The player character is displayed in the main menu screen, but it takes a second or so after their appearance for clothing and textures to follow. Even once everything is settled down, when new items are equipped, like the belt or shoes, they also take time to load in, and then more time still for higher levels of detail to load in. This texture pop-in is constant, and every change of location, the starting area, the plane, wherever the player walks, it temporarily turns the world into a muddy brown mess, more than it's supposed to be even. So, pop-in issues are a recurring theme for the Xbox One X version of PUBG. One oddity with the game is that pop-in and LOD scaling often seem to draw completely new or incorrectly scaled objects in place of the lower LOD objects. You can see this in the trees in the distance, for example, where sometimes it looks like there's a completely different mesh as we approach the tree and get closer to it. This is also highly visible in a scene where we're crashing through fences with a buggy. If we slow down time, which isn't hard, seeing as we're running below 30 FPS, you'll see that it appears that the static mesh fence is being replaced with a dynamic particle mesh version of the fence, and this would be done typically for destruction, as tracking dynamic particle meshes for every object across the entire game would likely cost too much in-system resources, so swapping out on impacts could save on resource cost. It appears as if the dynamic particle mesh version is scaled incorrectly though. If we freeze frame, you'll see that the replacement is larger than the static mesh, the first one, and that we then rubber band through it as the fence breaks apart. Texture pop-in is the most common issue. The parachute is an easy first scene example. Dropping into the map, the parachute takes several seconds to load its textures fully, and is exhibiting a normal map issue on the underside of the parachute. This seems to happen mostly when the camera is at glancing angles to the parachute, revealing the normal map artifacting underneath. You can see that in kind of the teal color. This specific set of issues is particularly embarrassing for PUBG, seeing as the parachute is an object that's only seen once in the game, at the very beginning, and then it's gone for the rest of the match. Texture popping issues can basically be seen everywhere. We see them on cars, like landing, for example, and seeing a car. We see them on the ground. At the start of the game, you can see the texture resolution kind of loading and unloading as the player count changes. Bridges, while skydiving, also have texture popping and some kind of LOD scaling in general that sometimes seems a bit odd. Buildings have their own popping issues. Tree alpha textures change, and plenty more. There are also problems with the environment popping, like when we observed parts of the world failing to draw, which seems like some kind of culling bug or something like that, because you can pan around from inside the plane and see that there's just a bit of almost culling lag as it's drawing the world underneath where the plane was previously occluding that world. This isn't really a big deal as it's not part of the game where it actually matters, you're not competing yet, but it just further illustrates the incomplete nature of PUBG, particularly on the Xbox One X, where it's still lagging behind in version number. It's not just textures, of course. Playing on a fiber connection even, we've noticed severe rubber banding that would indicate a server-side network or synchronization issue. This is partly visible when driving through destructible objects, as the static meshes again are swapped with particle meshes, but it's even more visible in occasional combat scenarios. In this example, we punched a lagged out, link-dead player to death, and then attempted to enter the garage with a motorcycle in it. The kill counter updated as 0 kills, we rubber banded in and out of the garage for a moment, and then it ticked over to 1 kill. Although less significant because it's pre-combat, we also experienced rubber banding when approaching the picnic tables in the pre-loaded match area of the game. It seemed to become more of an issue as players joined, of course, and similarly in our full 12-minute recording pass for one of the tests, we also noticed the fluctuating player count impacted even the ground texture resolution, with the ground texture's higher LOD unloading at one point. There are all kinds of other examples and oddities, like this split second, for example, where the wall disappears in one of the houses, which happens again a second later. Then there's moments before when the shadows were drawing incorrectly while parachuting down, and just generally graphics and visual issues that are either inconsistent with reality or just poor performance overall. Before starting with some of the on-screen graphics, we have a new data presentation method to show you what's happening with an Xbox in terms of frame rate. So what's going to happen is on the left of the screen, we will have a series of red and green bars. We'll also have ones and zeros, so it's a binary. Is this a new frame? Is it not a new frame? And then next to that, we have the frame count, the number of frames as the benchmark progresses. So every time you see a red bar, what that means is that we have dropped a frame. We can determine this by checking whether the pixels constitute a new frame or if there is no delta between pixels, which would demonstrate a repeated frame. So when you see a lot of red in a row, that means we are stuttering. We're replaying the most recent unique new frame over and over all the way through the red until we can finally get enough system resources to render a new frame represented by green. And if any of this confuses you, just check the article below. We'll try and explain it in more detail there. Getting into the performance discussion, you can again find our testing overview in the article linked below. But let's start out with a pre-match frame time chart, just because it's a bit extreme and it's one of the worst cases. So for this frame time chart, performance is disproportionately bad for the first few minutes of every match, which is illustrated here. As a reminder, we're looking at frame times versus time, and at 30 FPS, that means our target frame time should be 33.3 milliseconds. In other words, the frame-to-frame render interval to create a new frame is about 33 milliseconds. The clip starts around 33.3 milliseconds as expected, or 30 FPS, but has frequent spikes up to 100 milliseconds and 133 millisecond frame times. That means, in the worst case, you're waiting a full 133 milliseconds for the next unique frame to appear. In other words, you're staring at a redrawn version of the same frame for 1/10 of a second while waiting for the next one. That's a long time. Later in the chart, we encounter frame times that equate a rough 26 to 27 FPS average, never quite 30, shown by the rapid bouncing up and down of the frame time plot as it's between our measurement resolution and the actual intervals. And here's some pre-match footage. If there's any place in the game that should really overwhelm the Xbox, it is the pre-match free-for-all, where 100 players are scrambling to fire as many weapons as possible in close proximity. Assets load in here, players all leap around and jump en masse, and then explosions go off everywhere. Every time a Molotov explodes, the frame rate tanks. With a good fireball in view, the frame rate can dip as low as 12 FPS, and seeing an explosion during gameplay generally means that an enemy is within throwing distance, which is exactly the wrong time for performance to drop to 12. Again, 12 FPS. Watching smoke grenades go off in real combat had barely any impact whatsoever, which means that this seems more like a Molotov-specific issue for whatever's happening when that fire is being drawn. You'd have to find one outside of the pre-match and throw it to see the effect in real gameplay, of course, but after a countdown, everyone is abruptly teleported out of the pre-match area and into a featureless brown tube, which slowly resolves into a plane. For gameplay, performance doesn't matter until boots hit the ground, but it's still hard to accept the amount of time it takes to load trees, houses, and even the plane that's right in front of you as you dive towards the ground at 209 kilometers per hour. In our first skydiving run, shown in a frame time plot here, frame rate dropped to around 15 FPS between parachute deployment and hitting the ground. That was also just about enough time for the parachute's texture to fully load, right before it unloads and is never seen again. The first couple minutes after landing are the most dangerous. Our average frame rate stayed around 25 FPS in this time frame, and that potentially makes parachuting into popular areas for competing resources more difficult. After that, frame rates generally stayed around 30 FPS if we stayed in one place or walked, but dropped if we drove too quickly and entered new areas on a vehicle. This also happened if we smashed fences, as seen previously. Part of this is resource loading and unloading from adjacent cells as parts of the environment are dropped in and out of the player's viewport, but that might not seem too bad. But again, most console games do their utmost to never drop below their frame rate goal for even a fraction of a second, especially when that goal is only 30 FPS. This frame time chart shows the FPS averaging out to 26 to 27 during actual gameplay, which is certainly subpar and sometimes jarring overall, and then we do have occasional spikes. A fixed frame rate is the whole point of a console here, and we're losing that in PUBG. Surprisingly, one-on-one shooting, punching, and firefights had little impact on performance compared to the dips seen while driving a vehicle. LOD distance is obnoxiously low on foliage and trees, and there's clearly a visible line of grass that advances before the player. Network problems and general jankiness were far more pressing problems than frames per second during our time with the game. On more than one occasion, it was possible to walk straight up to an enemy, punch them, and they were either frozen helpless by lag or incapable of shooting at close range with the controller. It really didn't seem to matter. Lag-induced rubber banding happened multiple times. On our highest scoring run, where we really weren't trying, we only encountered 2 other players, both of whom chose to just drive away from us rather than deal with a fight. Eventually, we hit a rock at 90 miles per hour and ran ourselves over with our own motorcycle, but that can't really be blamed on the game. Watching this death, however, frame by frame, shows our character hitting the rock, flipping upside down, teleporting back towards the rock in a standing pose without the bike, and then equipping his gun, sliding back towards the river again, and abruptly dying. The camera then pans up to an invisible hill and plummets again as the ragdoll falls through the bottom of the river. On this note, we've observed several general collision issues and ragdoll physics defects when people die in the game. And just to make sure this wasn't some issue with the Xbox One X trying to run at 4K, we also manually forced 1080p through the Xbox settings. In this instance, we ended up with the frame time plot as seen on screen now, and frame rates still dropped below 30 FPS in the early parts of the game. We may do more precise comparisons in the future if we do a PC benchmark with this, but for now we can say that running at 1080p definitely doesn't solve the problems we've described on the Xbox One X. In its current state, PUBG on the Xbox One X is technically playable. You can play it. It's not really that enjoyable of an experience though. There's a lot of ground here for the developers to improve things, and it's hard to build an argument for the Xbox version versus the PC version, especially with the issues. The PC version's about one version number ahead at least, at 1.0 plus now, so that's a bit of a difference. The only real upside is that on the Xbox you don't really encounter hackers, which is somewhat of a rampant problem on PC, but none of those things really matter, because if we're looking at performance of the Xbox, the big thing to take away here in the current version of the game is that other than all the kind of weird visual oddities, texture pop-in, meshes, things like that, collision, there is objectively an inconsistent frame rate that can make it hard to play at times, or in the very least, unenjoyable, to a point of, in worst cases, hitting as low as 12 FPS. That's pretty damn bad. And it's not just 12 FPS either, because the idea of FPS, or frames per second, is almost sort of silly, because it inherently is an average as a metric, frames per second. But what's really happening when we say 12 FPS, it doesn't mean you're just getting 12 frames per second. It means that after you calculate out the huge frame time spikes, it happens to mathematically come out to 12, but you're not getting the updates in an interval that, as a player, would actually be any measure of fluid. Because when we're talking about a frame time spike of 133 milliseconds, dragging our average down to 12 FPS after it's calculated, which is just a function of 1,000 divided by the frame time, basically. When you're talking about that, ultimately what's happening is you're playing the game, and at some point during play, you hit something that causes the same frame to be redrawn at every interval for the next 1/10 of a second or slightly more. And that is absolutely noticeable. But some people call it stutter or hitching or things like that. The point is you're seeing the frame for 1/10 of a second, which is a long time. So yeah, that's PUBG on the Xbox. It's all the problems with PUBG on the PC when it was pre 1.0. I think it still has some problems, but not as bad. Compounded with being an Xbox. So it was definitely fun to test though, and it was worth improving our Xbox testing tools because of the problems. We'll look at the PC version next though, so subscribe for that as always. You can help us out directly on patreon.com/gamersnexus if you like this type of content, and go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one, or we did just restock our GN mugs. So thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.